Perhaps one of the most powerful displays of bending was never shown at all. Let's talk about how Monk Gyasto might have committed one of the Airbenders' greatest sins. Hey folks, welcome to the Geek Talk. For today's topic, let's discuss this little scene here with Monk Gyasto surrounded by a buttload of Fire Nation soldiers. Now, of course, as viewers, we are supposed to look at the scene and go, wow, Gyasto is such power. Wow, all those Fire Nation soldiers who were empowered by Sozin's comment couldn't take him down. Wow, such sad. Why the Fire Nation do the genocide? But we never got an answer about how exactly Gyasto took out all those Fire Nation soldiers. After all, the Airbenders were the only people group without a formal military. They preached non-violence and peace, which is why Aang had such a hard time coming to terms with killing Fire Lord Ozai in the final episodes of the series. So knowing this about the Air Nomads, how is it we see all of those corpses surrounding Monk Gyasto? Well, the assumption is that there was some sort of fight and Gyasto came out on top, at least for a while before he perished himself. However, there are no scorch marks on Gyasto's robes. Yes, they are frayed and tattered, but they are free of any burning. So what likely happened was that Gyasto pulled out some ancient and forbidden ability we had never seen before. But maybe we have seen it before, just in reverse order. Nearly 2 centuries later, there was a man who had an utter fascination with the ancient ways of the Airbenders. A man who grew up in a rough environment and would go on to help found an organization in direct opposition to another. That man, of course, is Zahir of the Red Lotus. Zahir was incredibly fixated on the ancient texts of the Airbenders of old, a group of people who might have been quite different from their modern counterparts. We should remember that the early times of the Avatar world, before the creation of the 4 nations, was riddled with human conflict, like those early conflicts in Avatar 1's time period, or the unification wars of the Fire Islands. And this time period was an era that was seemingly more nuanced where the Airbenders were concerned. A time that saw Airbenders like Guru Shokin, who advocated that people should follow their own path, unburdened by the morals or beliefs of society, which would likely go on to influence his contemporary Guru Lahima, who would promote such sayings as, "New growth cannot exist without first the destruction of the old," or "Let go your earthly tether, enter the void, empty and become wind." These musings seem to be a far cry from the more modern notions of the Air Nomad philosophy. And it was these musings that led Zahir to rediscover ancient abilities like unassisted flight, but also the abilities of force asphyxiation, which he used against the Earth Queen and later tried to use against Avatar Korra. You probably know where this line of thinking is headed. If Zahir was able to uncover this ability, then it must have meant it existed beforehand. And considering the interesting history of the Airbenders, it would seem these techniques came from the early Airbenders like the Gurus Shokin and Lahima. And if we look back at Monk Gyasto, an esteemed airbender with assumed decades of knowledge, it's very likely he came across some of these ancient techniques and philosophies and kept it in his back pocket. And it wasn't until the Fire Nation attacked that he brought it out, killing every Fire Nation soldier that was in his radius by way of this airbending asphyxiation technique. What do you think of this theory? I think it's a nice way of having some connective tissue between Legend of Korra and The Last Airbender, and I also think it's an interesting way to see that Airbenders are capable of some pretty nasty stuff when pushed to their back foot. That said, I do think it's a bit more awesome to say Gyasto simply kept fighting Fire Nation soldiers who entered his domain until he eventually exhausted himself. But perhaps both of these scenarios could be true. Maybe Gyasto did fight Firebender after Firebender until he realized the battle was ultimately lost. And then he chose to take his life and the life of his attackers in his vicinity by removing all air from the room. Or maybe something else happened. When we look at the result of this achievement, especially when making note that Gyasto was taking on Sozin's Comet-enhanced Firebenders, what he did was much more powerful than what Zahir did. Zahir was only using the ability against single targets, while Gyasto was using it against dozens of targets. And this makes sense. Zahir was operating off of lost information that was likely fragmented, especially when the Fire Nation likely burned most of the Airbender texts and scrolls. Monk Gyasto would have theoretically been operating off of more complete information, thus, he had a greater understanding of the ability. What I find most interesting about Gyato's potential use of the technique is that he seems he had never taught it to anyone else, notably Aang. We know that at age 12, Aang was a master of airbending and probably could have handled something like forced asphyxiation. And we know in our world, asphyxiation is not always deadly. In fact, most times it only results in a person passing out. This would be a very effective tool for an airbender trying to mitigate conflict with the least amount of damage done to an opponent. One counter to the theory of Gyasto using this deadly ability is that it's far too brutal for a character we saw who was extremely kind-hearted and empathetic. And yes, the ability is brutal for an airbender, but it's very possible that Gyasto was trying to give the other airbenders a chance to escape. After all, he was quite into the childlike things of life and likely was very protective of the children of the Air Temple, just as he was protective of Aang's own childhood. So to keep these personality traits in mind, perhaps it was Gyato's intention to merely force all the Fire Nation soldiers to pass out until Sozin's comet passed. Also, it didn't help that the room that he was in wasn't actually a room, but an open sort of under-rooted canopy encampment sort of a thing. For example, when we see Aang come into the room, he comes through a tent flap, which means that there was no way to lock in all of the air. Plus, it could have also been because the Fire Nation soldiers' attacks were too ferocious and dangerous, he couldn't find control to use his ability with as much nuance as he wanted to. Instead, he had to give in to the full extent of the deadly ability, which resulted in the demise of the Firebenders and himself. And that's it. What do you all think? Do you believe Monk Gyasto committed this act in the same way that Zahir did to the Earth King and to Avatar Korra? Was it intentional or unintentional? Or do you believe the fight between Gyasto and the Firebender soldiers happened on entirely different terms? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, peace, love, and remember, be water, my friends.